Hi, and welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, your place to learn about property investment, success, and money. Now, today's discussion is going to revolve around a topic that's creating, shockwaves throughout Australia, and that's the rental market crisis. We've seen vacancy rates plummet to historic lows, an ongoing squeeze in rental stock, and rents soaring like never before. With rental and vacancy rates as they are, many Australians are finding it difficult to secure stable, affordable housing. And the consequences of this situation are far-reaching, affecting everything from mental health to workforce stability, from family stability to the broader economy. So how did we land in such a predicament? What's the timeline for this crisis? Is there any end in sight? And most crucially, what does it mean for you as a property investor? So to help me dissect these complex issues, I'm joined today by Brett Warren, National Director of Metropole Property Strategists, who's going to bring a wealth of experience and insight to our discussion. As you join us, Brett and I are going to delve into the roots of the rental crisis, discuss how the current market trends might play out, and consider some potential strategies for investors navigating these turbulent waters. So whether you're a seasoned investor, just somebody dipping their toes in the property market, or even a tenant wanting to understand the current market, I hope our conversation today is going to give you some valuable insights and some strategies to help navigate this challenging landscape. So sit back or keep walking, I don't know what you're doing as you're listening to this, and get ready as we unpack the Australian rental crisis on today's episode of the Michael Yardney podcast.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment, and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect, and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now, here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
Australia's rental markets are in crisis. Vacancy rates are at historic low. Rental stock continues to remain slim. And rents, they're skyrocketing. So how did we get into this rental crisis? How long will it last? And what's it going to mean for you and me as property investors? That's what I want to discuss today with Brett Warren, National Director of Metropole Property Strategists. Hi, Brett.
Hey, Michael, good to be with you. Very, very interesting times, isn't it? It's something that's kind of snuck up upon us, but it's been going on for a while, all of these things, hasn't it? And that's what we're going to unpack today.
You're right, actually. I mean, it's not something that's happened overnight. It seems to have suddenly lines over the last 6 months or so. So maybe we should set some context to the Australian property markets first, and then we'll dig into the rental crisis and what it can mean. Now, I know it's going to mean different things for different investors. Some are actually getting out of the market, which I think is the wrong idea. But for others who've got it, will be able to offer that. They'll see the opportunity there. So maybe let's dig into the latest Australian Bureau of Statistics data. Tell us a bit about how many houses there are in Australia and the composition of them.
Yeah, look, I think it's important to put some context together, and the way we do that at Metropole, obviously, is taking a bit of the emotion out of it and just focusing on more about the data and the numbers, because that certainly sets a framework and tells a story. So, look, there's nearly 9.8 million households in Australia in 2021, and the huge majority of those are obviously owner-occupiers. So around 66 to 67% of those households, and that's about 6.2 million households, are homeowners. So that conversely means that the other 31% of the 9.8 million are renters and tenants. So interesting to understand, Michael, where the tenancies come from. And I guess 91% of tenants, which is 2.4 million households, are rent from private landlords. And that's a huge proportion, isn't it?
Compared to other parts of the world, definitely. In other words, the government isn't even trying to help tenants.
That's the hard part. 3% of the population, which is only 278,000 households, rent from state or territory housing, and then the other 2.4% rent from other landlords. So I guess the remaining 2.1% of that are other tenancies, including households that are not owner-occupier or mortgages or renters or anything like that.
It hasn't changed a lot. The percentage of Australians who are homeowners has dropped a little bit from around 70% to 66, 67%. But it really depends upon your age as well, doesn't it, as to whether you're a home owner or not?
Yeah, Michael, that's right. And look, not surprisingly, age does play a significant role. As we go on and time goes on and we get older, then the home ownership increases. So data shows that, I guess, up until mid-30s, the majority of Australians do rent rather than own their own home. Starting at that early age bracket, that 15 to 24 age bracket, there's only 10% of people that own homes, I guess, in their lower 20s. And that means the majority, 84% of renters. It does take time to save a deposit. They have time to settle and I guess, meet partners and do those types of things. And they've obviously got other priorities. But once we start kind of getting to that 25 to 35 age bracket, it does jump up to, 40 and even 50% once we start to get from 35 to 44 into the family formation stage. So, I guess 35 to 44, you've settled, you've got a family, close to 57% are homeowners. And that means the other 42% roughly are renters and tenants. And then it starts to increase again, 45 to 54 goes to 70, and then all the way up to about 81 to 83% once you start to hit towards 70. So, it does suggest that obviously as we get older, that there's definitely more home ownership there and less tenants. But as you pointed out correctly before, Michael, I guess the home ownership rates are falling. And according to the ABS, back in 1991, 71.4% of us were homeowners, and that's only really around 67.8% now. So that's really a 3 or 4% drop over that time. There has been several factors to contribute to that decline. The number one thing is cost of housing and obviously cost of living as well with interest rates, and especially with that type of climate at the moment. And obviously it's made it more difficult to, I guess, in the big capitals in Sydney and Melbourne where we've really experienced that. And another change in factor is obviously the younger generations to, I guess, delay. Generations ago, Michael, everyone was settling down in their 20s or 30s, and I guess the next generation are probably delaying that a little bit more and choosing to rent rather than to buy a home. So there's a really good snapshot, I guess, to start with of home ownership. But maybe you could tell us a little bit about those trends with renters and tenants, Michael.
Sure. So, as you say, as you get older, you're more likely to own your home. What surprised me, though, actually it's not that new, is that even at the age of 75, 13% of people are tenants. That's scary when you've got to be on, many of them would be on the pension and not owning their own home. So even though we spend a lot of time talking about property investment, at least every Australian should end up owning a home and having it paid off when they get to their golden years to be able to enjoy it rather than being dependent on other people. But if you look at tenants, it's suggested that 31% of Australia's population are tenant. That's a huge volume of renters looking for or needing accommodation. Look, unlike in other countries, as we said already, the majority of Australians rent from private landlords. Only 3%, as you said, rent from the government. Now, that's an Australian government decision. They've actually decided not to provide rental accommodation. They're using their funds elsewhere. And so just like in hospitals, there are public hospitals and private hospitals. The private system helps the government provide healthcare as it does with public transport. And it's doing much the same with accommodation. The government's not got a high priority of providing rental accommodation like many other countries overseas do. But I think the other really important thing to recognise is not all tenants are the same. A small group of Australians are always going to be socially disenfranchised. They're going to need social housing. And in my mind, that's the government's responsibility. We pay our taxes. The government should be helping those people who are going to have their personal, their psychological, their social challenges. They're always going to be forced to rent. But in fact, a lot of Australians rent just because they choose to. It's the stage of their life. They may have moved to a new state. They may have moved just even to a new location in the same state. Maybe they've just got married or divorced, or they're renovating their home, or they're buying a new home, or there's more people rent vesting because they can't afford to own where they want to live. So it just means that not all tenants are poor. Many tenants are doing it by choice. And that's an important factor to remember. So the accommodation for all these people are currently being funded by everyday Aussie investors. And over the last 30 years, Australia's population increased by 8.4 million. But the state governments, I read, have sold off 100,000 publicly owned rental properties. Now, I'm not sure what it was like in other states, Brett, but when you come to Melbourne, you see those big high-rise concrete towers that were public housing, and in each state they did it slightly differently. They're just not building public housing anymore, are they?
No, they're not. And look, I remember probably a decade ago now as a buyer's agent, and we're still doing this now, Michael, in Brisbane. They're selling off those types of properties where there were social housing. And look, we're lucky enough to pick a couple of those up. But as you're mentioning, and as we're going to start pointing out, the majority of those properties are selling to owner-occupiers, and that's really reducing that tenancy pool. So you're 100% right.
Interestingly, over the last decade, there's been about 1 million first-home buyers, and that's really good. Now, we know a lot of that's been because of government incentives, the first homeowner grant, and those grants that were given during COVID. So people are moving out of the rental market. They're getting into housing, but with overseas migration ramping up at the moment, and that's also being stimulated by the government, we've just not got enough accommodation. Australia's always been a country built on overseas migration, but the federal government has committed to really high levels of overseas migration, in part to resolve the skills shortages across most industries. But interestingly, the Australian economy is structured as a migration nation. This government doesn't want to be seen as a government getting us into recession. So therefore, if more migrants are coming and they've got to form households, and that means they've got to buy refrigerators and televisions and sofas and things like that, what's happening is, I guess, migration is boosting our economy. And currently population is growing at about 2% per annum. But dwelling growth, the number of new dwellings we're building, hasn't gone up a lot. And we know currently builders are having challenges. So dwelling growth is about 1%. In other words, more population growth than dwelling growth. But that's already coming from a base where we don't have enough dwellings. So where are all these overseas migrants going to live? They don't bring a home with them, Brett.
No, they don't. They certainly don't. And obviously that's the huge concern at the moment, because what we're starting to see now, the other side of the equation is obviously people are starting to sell up, cost of living starting to rise. We've had almost 12 or 13 interest rate rises in a row. So investors are losing a bit about their patience. We'll talk about a few other things in a moment. But certainly they're selling up. They feel like they're losing a bit of control of their future and their financial certainty. And most of those properties that are going on the market are being replaced by homeowners. And I think there was a really alarming stat just after COVID. I think a lot of the McGraths and the Ray Whites, I think they lost, Michael, 20 or 25% of the value of their rent roll because homeowners were actually buying the properties that were going up and selling as investors.
Well, recently there was a statistic by CoreLogic that a third of properties that hit the sale market in the month of May 2023, a couple of months ago, but the figures only just came out, were previously rental properties. Over a third, and in some locations it was up to 50%, like in the Sydney CBD, where I guess there were a lot of apartments being sold up by investors. I remember at the end of last year when we ran our annual property investment sentiment survey, about a third of the investors had sold up or were planning to sell a property this year. And I think they're just sick of the ongoing interference. But as you say, this is just creating a shortage of rental properties because owner-occupiers are snapping them up. So what that currently means is that there is a shortage of properties, rents are skyrocketing, vacancy rates are low, and people are saying, oh, it's ugly, greedy landlords making up for the rise in their mortgage costs, the rise in their holding costs. No, it's market forces. In other words, rents are affected by supply and demand. And 2-3 years ago, when COVID changed circumstances and people moved out of apartments, they went back to mum and dad, or they moved to regional areas, rents went down. In fact, a recent survey by PIPA, the Property Investment Professionals of Australia, showed that over the last decade, rents haven't even kept up with inflation. So they're just now catching up. It's not ugly, greedy landlords taking advantage of this. But we have had a very long, strong now, almost 2 years of rental growth, and there's no end in sight. I know at Metropole Property Management, we manage over $2 billion worth of assets for our clients, and any time a property is becoming vacant, we're able to push up rents considerably, that our landlords, our investors get good rents, but even just at rent reviews. So the real question at the moment, the media is having a field day, is who's to blame? Yeah. Who's to blame for all this, Brett?
Yeah, it's a great question. And obviously there's a lot of answers which we're obviously going to unpack now. So look, I think the main cause is obviously undersupply. And we talk a bit about a balanced market having a vacancy rate of around 2%. which is kind of, a break-even point, I guess. But at the moment, it sits at just 1.2%, which is quite extraordinary. So I guess as we unpack it from a bigger picture perspective, the obvious answer is there's fewer rental properties in Australia today because there's fewer investors buying properties, and owner-occupiers are really dominating that market. And as we spoke about before, a number of investors are selling up, and that's starting to trend upwards. So the problem is there isn't enough rental stock for 31% of the population. The government's not providing any more either, Michael, and that's another concern as well. So
they were going to encourage 100,000 new dwellings, but that wasn't for rental stock. They were just trying to encourage people to build new dwellings, and now there's the build to rent phase where the government's giving big overseas corporations in tax incentives to build, but that's not going to be affordable accommodation. So if we look at why the supply is low, I guess there's a couple of reasons. As you've already said a few times, a huge portion of investors sold up. In fact, not just now, it was during the boom. Remember when people would say, an agent knocked on my door and he told me he can sell my property at a good price, so I want to sell. And I know our property strategists would say to them, hang on, stop. Why would you sell? Your property's doing what it was meant to do. It's gone up in value.
Yeah, exactly. We had the same thing a lot here as well, and people were being teased with big prices and things like that as well. So we definitely saw that.
Sure. So why is the supply low? Investors sold up. Also, I think higher borrowing costs at the moment and the media giving a lot of negative messages mean that fewer investors are in the market at the moment, fewer investors getting into the market. But I think another factor really is increased government interference. People are sick of this tighter rental laws actually dissuading, they're stopping people from getting into the market. One of the attractive advantage of being a property investor is that you've got control. You've got control of how you improve your asset. You can renovate it. You can do things with it. You can choose to sell it or keep it, upgrade it. But tighter rental laws have recently been favouring the tenants, reducing the amount of control investors have got. I mean, in Victoria, there were 83 new changes to the tenancy regulations. They were rolled out in 2021, and I can tell you none of them were in favour of the landlord. Recently, our property management team in Brisbane has had to get to understand a whole lot of rental tenancy changes in Queensland. And now, just recently, it's been announced that there's a rental tenancy commissioner in New South Wales newly appointed, and I can tell you she's not going to be in favour of the landlords. So property investors are feeling the government's interfering more. The other factor, I think, is that there's actually just not a lot of new accommodation being built that's, I guess, investor friendly. A lot of the investment stock was built by developers, in particular for overseas investors. Now, that wasn't good investment stock. It wasn't the things you and I would have recommended and our clients at Metropole wouldn't have bought. But overseas investors actually pre-purchased off the plan apartments in those big towers that provided a lot of accommodation. That's not happening at the moment. So we get a lot less stock at a time when demand's high because we got higher migration. But one of the other really interesting things is the change in household size, Brett. It seems like there's fewer of us in each household, not a lot smaller, but interestingly, according to the previous couple of census datas when they've looked over the last few years, the average household size dropped from 2.59 people to 2.55 people. And that doesn't sound like much at all. But interestingly, it translates to the need for 160,000 additional dwellings just for the same number of people. So I think part of that came from COVID when we didn't want to share as much accommodation. We didn't want to be with as many other people there. And we're wanting different sort of accommodation now with many of us working from home. You're looking for a room for home office, wanting larger dwellings. You're wanting some backyards. So there's a real bottleneck at the moment, Brett.
Well, it certainly is. And obviously, the increased cost of housing and things like that as well has made it extremely difficult. There's a lack of good quality properties on the market anyway, as well, causing a bottleneck, and people are lining up through open homes and things like that as well. It's taking that next generation, as we spoke about, longer to kind of lay down their roots and move to that family formation stage. So they're choosing to rent rather than buy a home. And I guess getting back to the data again, Michael, the government data certainly shows that there's certain age groups that are declining more in home ownership over the years. So if we go back to 1971 versus kind of today, 2016 when it was last taken, the number of homeowners aged 25 to 34 years dropped from 57% down to 44.6%. So that's almost a 14% decrease, which is quite extraordinary. And then that family formation stage we were talking about will drop from 71.4% in 2016, so down to almost 10% to 62% today, which is quite extraordinary.
This isn't good. I know as property investors, we like it when our rents go up, but in a country like Australia, the best country in the world, to hear that people can't get accommodation, to see pictures in the media about tent cities. We used to look at people in America who lived under the bridges in tents and in cardboard boxes. We really don't want that to happen in Australia. People deserve much better than that, but there's no end in sight. And that's a real concern. That's bad news, because that's not the way we should be living. It can't be solved quickly. In fact, unfortunately, I think it's only going to get worse. There's a perfect storm of ultra-low vacancy rates, rising rents, low supply. Even if they suddenly start building, it'll take a long, long time for that to happen. And the government's not going to change its policy on immigration anytime soon. Now, I wonder if some immigrants are going to stop coming here if they hear that they can't get accommodation. But it's making it very, very difficult. And I can't see in the short term that we're going to get more investors. I think that's one of the answers. By the way, that's not going to actually create more supply. So on the one hand, we need more supply, but on the other hand, we need investors to own and supply rental accommodation. But maybe we could just look at what investors have had to put up with over the last decade, over the last 10 years. And as you go through this list that you've provided me with, Brett, it doesn't surprise me that investors are saying, I've had enough. I want to get out. So maybe let's just look back over the last decade at all the hurdles property investors had to go through.
It's really interesting, isn't it? And none of these, it's almost like death by 1,000 cuts, isn't it? Because none of these things individually are going to make a huge difference to your portfolio. But, when you're looking at some of the things that have happened over the last decade, so if we go back to kind of, 2014, I guess, is when we first started seeing the APRA regulator start to, control the bank's ability to lend to investors. And by 2016, I guess there was a focus on removing interest only. And for the first time in history, Michael, we saw a real difference between, if you're an investor, you actually had to pay more to borrow money than a homeowner.
Yeah, and they capped the amount that each bank could lend in interest only and lend to investors. That's right. That came because at one stage there were a lot of investors, 50% of all properties being bought during the boom in 2015-16 in Sydney were to investors. And APRA was concerned, rather than allowing the market to just work its way through and natural forces to occur, it limited that. And you're right, that's sowed the seeds of the problems today.
Yeah, and the next one in 2017, before that last election with the Labor Party, threatening to remove negative gearing. I guess that cost them the election in the end, but it was part of the reason. But I guess that really started the stigma about greedy investors. They're negative gearing and they're greedy. And I think part of that stigma, which we're seeing today, is the average investor is just someone trying to get ahead. And certainly a lot of our clients, Michael, they're not greedy, and they're really wanting to put their family's future first. And they're actually, with 91% of the market, providing a valuable service for the community.
Well, interestingly, we know that the statistics in general are that close to 90% of investors only own one property, 92% don't own more than two properties. So they're not property moguls. Now, we also know that our clients at Metropole are 7.3 times more likely than the average investor to own 6 or more properties because they've made the right decisions, because they've been given the right advice. But again, we're not seeing them as greedy investors. They're taking a commercial risk. They're taking a financial risk. And some of them are challenged a little bit with rising interest rates at the moment, but most have been prepared because we've helped them put buffers in place. But the government is seeing investors as an aid ATM. So remember back in 2017, they removed depreciation allowances on existing properties. They stopped you being able to pay. So I've got properties interstate, so do you, but you aren't allowed to claim travel expenses.
No, and I think around the same time, APRA also really ramped up and really restricted those overseas investors that, as you said before, probably buying not the type of properties we'd buy, but they're still providing, I guess, accommodation for tenants, aren't they?
They pulled out the welcome mat. They put extra stamp duty. They've charged them extra fees. You're 100% right. And then APRA increased their buffers, the 3%, it went to 2.5%, then 3%. They increased what was called the lending floor rate, where banks, even though interest rates were much lower, had to assume that you'd be borrowing at 7%. And then there was all those government tenancy reforms in Victoria. There was huge, massive tenancy changes favouring tenants in 2020, in Queensland in 21, ACT in Western Australia proposing tenancy reforms. And as I said a moment ago, the New South Wales has now got a tenancy commissioner. And then, of course, in 2022, the Reserve Bank raised interest rates. Boy, have property investors had a lot to put up with.
Well, then we can also add the threat for stamp duty in Queensland, and now Victoria's got stamp duty amendments as well. And everyone seems, as with the tenancy reforms, it starts in one state and everyone catches on and moves forward. So,
the land tax changes in Victoria too. That's right, yes.
Yeah. So huge amount of things happening there, isn't there? So I guess, look, again, the government's providing a short amount, but they're trying to get those large corporations to incorporate those build-to-rate rent segments and schemes that seem to be working overseas. But that's really not going to afford any affordable accommodation, is it?
No, it's not. So what's the answer? Well, we know a particular party of a particular colour. Okay, let me say it. The Greens are proposing rental freezes or rental caps. They think that that's going to actually help the market. They don't get it. They don't get how the market works, because there's been lots of studies overseas. They've tried it overseas in Europe and America, and in fact, it doesn't create more affordable accommodation. It pulls investors out of the market, because they're losing control. And so supply and demand means that rents go up. It also means that investors aren't prepared to spend as much doing up their properties. If they're not going to get more rent, why should I keep reinvesting in it? So capping rents actually gives poorer housing stock and less of it. Why would you invest if you're losing control? There's other things you can invest in instead. So I guess where we're back to is there's no easy fix. The truth is the rental crisis is going to remain with us for some time until supply increases. I guess the government can make sure rental laws are balanced. In other words, give protection to renters. There's no doubt that there are some slum landlords that have given renters a difficult time, and that shouldn't be happening either. But landlords should also be able to have control over their valuable asset and the risks they've taken. I think the government should encourage mum and dad investors to invest in property, stop putting barriers in the way. I think the government should make it easier for investors to borrow, not more expensive. At present, lenders stress test borrowers' capacity to service your loan at 3% above the current interest rates, which means you've got to be able to refinance, be able to service your loan at 9% at the moment. That's unlikely, and interest rates are going to go up much more. But I think if we look at it, if you take a long-term view, if you take a strategic view, the rental crisis, and again, we're not wishing it on anyone or on any tenant, but if that's the world that's happening at the moment and you're able to, it creates a window of opportunity for investors.
Look, it certainly does, and we don't want to, I guess, take advantage of this situation. But if I just take you back for a second, Michael, it's all. I agree with 100% with these measures and these changes. But for a government to do that, there's got to be a real strong, I guess, mental shift and I guess message being put across to actually help people understand that the average person is not a greedy investor. And I think there's a real mindset shift that needs to change there, because I think a lot of governments are very short-term focused. They live off the polls from one day to the next and the research. And if they're talking to people who are tenants and they don't like greedy investors, this is kind of how we ended up here, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Having said that, a lot of politicians do own investment properties, but that's an interesting thought. So if you've got long-term focus, this opportunity that we're currently seeing the beginning of a new property cycle is a great time. You don't get the beginning of a new property cycle very often. Now, we're not saying try and time the market, but we know that the market bottomed early this year. We know we're now in the recovery phase of the property cycle. We also recognise that it's going to be a very fragmented market moving forward, and you shouldn't invest only for rents, but if you get, or for yield, that's in fact not the way we believe residential real estate works. But if you've got the opportunity to get in, if it's right for you, this is a great opportunity because properties are still cheaper than they were 12 months ago. Now, in all the big capital cities, they're going up bit by bit each month, so we're almost back to where we were before. But I think if you look back in 3 years' time, you're going to think, gee, the property I bought in 2023 is pretty cheap. Because at the moment, there is still slowish consumer confidence. Buyers are back, but still there's others sitting on the sidelines. There's the talk about maybe another interest rate rise or not, maybe about recession. So those who can actually plan and get into the market now and take advantage before FOMO takes hold again, as it eventually will. Because I think later this year, early next year, Brett, the general public, rather than just the smart investors, people who listen to this, read Property Update, inform themselves, the general public's going to realise, okay, that's the end of interest rate rises. They're going to realise, hey, inflation peaked 6-9 months ago, and they're going to just get on with their lives.
Well, we are starting to see that a little bit, but it's the old saying, isn't it? When you hear the Uber driver now, or the taxi driver, or the hairdresser talking about property and it's a good time to invest, you're probably far too late. So I've got a question for you, Michael. Look, and this is really, really important. Why would you invest? As an investor, you're getting beaten up. There's people who are sitting on the sidelines asking themselves this question. You mentioned before if it's the right time for you. What would you say to someone where it is the right time, but interest rates are going up, cost of living's rising, tenancy laws are changing, a lot of uncertainty on the market? You've kind of short answered the question that in 3 years' time you're going to be in a better position. But what makes you and what makes your mindset deal with those issues better than anyone else, if that makes sense?
I like to have expectations rather than forecasts, and I think that's what makes the big difference. So I know what I want in the long term, and when our clients come to us and sit down at Metropole, people who want to start working with us, we ask, what do you want your future to look like? And most of them are wanting choices in life. Most of them are wanting financial freedom. Now, some of them are wanting it now. They're saying, I want to buy an investment property so it pays for the kids' school fees, or I want to buy an investment property so I can go on holidays. That's not how property works. But most people are now educated to know that it's going to take some time to build a portfolio. And the longer you leave it, the shorter your runway is going to be. Who wouldn't have liked to have bought, even during the depths of COVID? Who wouldn't have liked to have bought during the difficult times before the 2019 election when property values went down? It's easy to look in retrospect. So why I was talking about expectations rather than forecasts is I'm not going to forecast. I know we've got a beginning of a new property cycle. It's going to end again one day. I don't know exactly when that is. I know interest rates are going to go up a little bit more and then they're going to go down. But I don't know when that's going to happen or how much they're going to drop. I know that we're going to have some economic challenges. I don't know how bad they're going to be. I think the world's going to break again. It seems to break every 10 years, but I don't know what it's going to be this time. Last time it was COVID, but there was a war overseas. But by expecting things to go wrong, but that's very different to a forecast saying in January 2027 the market's going to turn. It actually makes me a more strategic investor. I prepare for the worst, but I expect the best, and I look after my financial future knowing things are going to go wrong, knowing the government's going to interfere, knowing that by the time I retire, I may not be able to negatively gear, I may not be able to have depreciation, I may not be able to get money out of my super. There's going to be so many changes, but what I do know is that if between now and then I build a substantial asset base, I will have choices. And if I don't have a substantial asset base, I'm going to be dependent on the government, and I don't want that. So I think it's that wanting control of your long-term rather than short-term financial future, Brett, that should make people say, hey, forget all the noise. Invest in something that has always worked, not the next hotspot, not what's just working now.
It's really interesting because if we look at kind of a balancing scale, so many people that short-term focus, and the scale's really tipping towards, not investing because of the things we've outlined. But if you can look at the longer term and understand what the outcomes will be over the next 10 or 15 years, as you said before, if you expect the worst to happen and it does, and you still get through that period, as you said before, you're going to have those choices, aren't you?
Well, there's always reasons not to invest. A couple of years ago was COVID and the lockdowns. A year or so ago, it was the war in Ukraine. What's that going to do? There was oil crises, economic crises, rising interest rates, government interference. Every year there's an X factor that comes out as well. There's always reasons not to invest. There's always going to be people in the media telling you not to invest. But anyone who said, oh, gee, I shouldn't have invested 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Yeah, there's people who invested at the wrong time a year or two ago and don't have a long-term focus. But don't look for all those reasons not to invest. Find the reasons you should, and then do it smartly, because if you do it strategically, you're more likely to outperform the averages, because moving forward, because of these challenges, because of affordability issues, because of inflation, the markets are going to be very fragmented, Brett.
Terrific. Any final notes for investors? Because it is a bit of an uncertain time.
Well, I guess the first thing is get a good team of people around you. Try not to do it all on your own. And we've got a vested interest. People are going to say, oh, look, you're Australia's largest buyer's agent. But we're actually a lot more than a buyer's agency. People come to us and say, I want to buy the next property. They're surprised when we stop them. What we do is put together a strategic plan first. We actually help them plan to become the people they plan to become. It's what I said a moment ago. We bring their future into the present and help them plan to do that. And then the property they eventually buy is the physical manifestation of all those decisions. And there's no rush at the moment. So we have to do things in the right order. So don't try and do it on your own. It's actually just too hard to do. So if you're interested, and it's a shameless plug, why not get Brett or his team to have a chat with you? Go to metropole.com.au. And as I said, we're more than just ordinary buyer's agents. We have strategic wealth advice, property management, renovations, development. We help you put a plan together. And then we actually annually keep a track of you, review you to make sure that you're on the right track. So if you're a beginner, we'd love to help you. And if you've already got a portfolio and you're wondering, is it actually going to get me to where I want to get to? I guess that's one of the things we do too, Brett. We review their portfolio, so we help fix problems, we help prevent problems, and we help them outperform the market.
Yeah, it's just like being a business, isn't it? We've got to treat it like a business, find the strengths and the weaknesses and turn them around.
Well, fantastic. Thank you for your time, Brett. So no end in sight to the rental crisis, and that is a shame. I bet we're going to be talking about it again over the next couple of years.
I think you can guarantee it, unfortunately. Yep, that's right.
Speak again soon. Thanks, Brett.
Thanks, Michael.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
I'd like to have a little chat with you about 7 powerful beliefs of ultra-successful people. You see, at the moment, there's so much uncertainty in the world. There are so many negative things happening that I'd like to share with you how some successful people have become even more successful. Because I think we all need some positivity. And the answer is, if other people manage to do this, so can you. Sure, it's true that successful people get that way through a combination of hard work, positivity, and sometimes they even get a little bit of luck along the way. But many successful people, and I've mentored a lot of very successful people and deal with a lot of successful business people, entrepreneurs and investors at Metropole, and also through our Business Accelerator Mastermind program, I've found that many successful people also have powerful beliefs that help guide their journey to the top. The secret is they understand that success is an attitude. It comes from a framework of powerful beliefs and empowering thoughts. So I'd like to share those beliefs with you now, because I'd like to see what you can get out of this to help you reach your goals as well. That's because powerful, successful people believe that the systems inform and inspire their actions, and ultimately it's what makes them successful in everything they do. So let's go through some of these beliefs. The first one is that successful people believe in themselves. I found in general a lot of Australians don't have self-confidence, don't have self-respect, and that holds them back. But if you don't believe in your own abilities, if you don't believe in your own potential, how can you expect anyone else to? That's why incredibly successful people have great self-confidence that even when they may not have all the answers, they believe they can work it out. What it comes down to is that they've got faith in themselves and their potential for greatness. Now, that's not vanity. That's very, very different. You see, the ultra-successful know that if you don't believe in yourself, in your abilities, no one else will. The second important belief of ultra-successful people is they believe they're in charge of their life. This is really important. Here's the thing. They believe that life doesn't happen to them, that life is a result of how they respond to the challenges and the opportunities. They believe they're the pilots of their life, not just a passenger going along for a ride. But in these challenging times we've had recently, a lot of people are playing the victim, and it's not their fault, it's the government's fault, it's everybody else's fault. Successful people have this empowering belief that they're responsible for what they make of any given situation. So that's what allows them to take charge of their destiny. In other words, they don't let setbacks set them back. Instead, they use them as learning experiences and they move on. Another powerful belief that successful people have is that there's opportunities everywhere. So while the recent coronavirus issues have created a lot of people to doubt their future, to be stuck in fear and calamity, successful people are looking for opportunities. That's one of the most powerful beliefs they have. They have an abundant mindset. Where many people see obstacles, see scarcity, successful people see stepping stones. They see stepping stones to great opportunities. Successful people are problem solvers. They're not complainers. And that makes a world of difference. As we work through the 7 beliefs that successful people have, the fourth one I'd like to share with you is their belief in doing things that no one else will. Incredibly successful people don't shy away from taking risks. In fact, they try new things even if they seem trivial, even if they seem simple. What it boils down to is they understand that to be different, they must act differently. They must be willing to try things that others won't. But the risks they take, they're calculated risks. So they're not really that risky. They've got a plan B. They know what's going on. They recognise that, in fact, the biggest risk is in themselves. So let me give you an example. If I asked you, is property development risky? You'd probably say yes. If you asked me, is property development risky? I'd say no. But then if you asked me, well, yeah, but Michael, would developing a 10-story, 12-story apartment block be risky? I'd say, yes, it is, because I've never done it before. So risk is very much in the investor rather than in the commodity, whether it's property, shares, whatever. Now, we're going through the beliefs of successful people. And as I was saying, successful people take risks. They also believe that execution is critical. You see, it's no coincidence that successful people execute what works. Time and time again. They take action. They understand that strategy is only as important as the execution. So you get a lot of information from my podcasts and my blogs, but the power's not in the information. The power is in the action you take. And unfortunately, most people don't take action. They don't act on what they know. In this world, you get paid on not what you know, but on what you do with what you know. So the secret to successful people is they develop an idea, they make a plan, they create a strategy, and then they execute it. And they repeat that strategy. And if they need to change it, they'll adapt it a bit. Another belief of successful people is they believe in winning through hard work. Yeah, it's not a surprise. Success comes from hard work. I know a lot of people look on the outside and think, oh, it's just luck. No, it's not. Successful people know that work comes first and then payoff comes later. When others quit and compromise their values, successful people keep going. The reason why they become victors in the end is not so much because they're smarter or better connected or more talented. It's because the last person left standing when others fail is the winner. So they just keep going and they work harder. And the last belief of successful people I'd like to share with you today, I'm sure they've got lots, but the last one I'd like to share with you is they believe in giving back. Now, most people don't recognise this, but a lot of charity comes from the wealthy people. I've said it before, giving back is one of the ways successful people show their gratitude for all the opportunities they've been given. Giving back also keeps them grounded, keeps them humble, keeps them in touch with reality. Believing in the power of giving back reminds them they must keep working and playing their part to make the world a better place for everybody. So people often ask me, why do you give away so much information for free? Why do you do all this? And I've been very fortunate. I've come from humble beginnings and I'm now fortunately very successful in business and wealthy in a whole lot of ways. And I believe it's part of my responsibility to help other people up the ladder as well. And that's why I ask you to keep sharing this podcast with other people. Jointly together, we can actually help more people become successful. But this last belief of successful people is a lesson for all of us. If everyone had the habit of sharing the blessings in their lives, we'd all be happier. We'd all be richer for it. Believing that you can be successful is part of the secret to achievement, but believing that you can make a difference in other people's lives is also a valuable lesson for everyone too. So now there's a time for you to believe in yourself. It's a time for you to take action and set yourself up for the opportunities that are going to present themselves as our property markets move on. So if you're wondering what's ahead in these confusing times, why not have a chat with my team at Metropole to help provide you with direction, to help provide you with guidance, to help get you results. In challenging times like we're experiencing, you need an advisor who takes a holistic approach to your wealth creation. And that's exactly what you get from my team at Metropole. We've got no properties for sale, but if you're looking to get into property, we've got a number of ways of helping you. We put together strategic property plans so you can plan to become the person you plan to become. Hey, wasn't that one of the beliefs of successful people? We have a buyer's agency, Australia's most trusted buyer's agent, who've been involved in over $3.5 billion worth of property transactions. We can help you too. We have a wealth advisory division run by Ken Race. We've got property management divisions, renovations and development. Why not go to metropole.com.au and start with a strategic chat, metropole.com.au, or call us on 1300 Metropole. I'd love to be part of your wealth creation journey. Well, thanks for spending the last little while with me, and I hope you got some benefit from this show. If you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there's 3 little buttons down the bottom. Press it and share it, or just tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you'll definitely be doing me a favour and helping me in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. Now, there's ways of catching up with me between these shows. Just look for Michael Yardney on social media, or why not join my private Facebook group? Go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And I have a way of saying thank you to you for subscribing to this podcast. Go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where you can get a bunch of ebooks and reports. My way of saying thank you. And when you've got time, why not listen to some of the old podcasts? There's individual lessons in each of those that I think would be helpful for you. I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?